Until recently, this was Soviet airspace. And these warplanes were the foundation of the USSR's enormous protective shield. Among these aerobatic jet fighters is the Sukhoi 25. The Su-25 soared onto the world stage during the war which was to become the Soviets' Vietnam. Today, even though the Soviet Union is no more and the Cold War is over, Russia's elite group of fighter pilots uphold a long and distinguished tradition.
We have to give advice to young pilots joining our squadron. The main thing is to give young pilots the opportunity to fly, to give them the opportunity to do what they would love to dedicate their lives to.
With the advent of market forces and the collapse of the military funding systems, these pilots at Lipetsk Air Base, as well as everyone else in Russia, are experiencing severe cutbacks. For Sukhoi 25 Squadron Commander Andrei Samotsvet, getting enough flying time for his pilots is a constant challenge.
Unfortunately, a lot of good pilots had to change their occupation. For the Air Force, it was not good.
The Lipetsk Air Base Simulator facility has seen better days. However, bare light bulbs and tattered linoleum have always been the standard here, even in the days of the mighty Soviet Empire. The Russian Air Force has lacked the technological edge which the Western Air Forces have taken for granted. This 1985 model flight simulator is symbolic of the underfunding in the Russian military. A scrolling terrain board is used for practicing flight maneuvers. The same practice in the US Air Force is done with elaborate 3D virtual landscapes. Because jet fuel is in short supply, this may be the only flying pilots will do this month. Money is so tight, a mechanic cannot be hired to repair the simulator cockpit's roll, pitch, and yaw motions.
We have a whole massive force of people who've been laid off. Half, probably, if not more, maybe 2/3 or 3/4, who are redundant, waiting for this to pick back up. And they will do it for free if they have to. If nothing else, they get lunch.
Everything in the Russian Air Force, from personnel to planes, has been affected by massive downsizing. Before 1991, the Soviet Air Force had 20,000 pilots and 13,000 planes.
The morale of the Air Force, both soldiers and officers, was very high at all times. And it was a special additional weapon.
It is true that pilots were always considered to be more intelligent. They were always the elite of the armed forces. That is why they are more democratic. They have a different relationship among themselves. And pilots are good guys.
This area, which is this. The largest Western stereotype of the Russian pilot was that he had no independent thought capability. This guy took orders from the ground, listened to a radio, just basically a robot. He was an automatic pilot that was made out of flesh. And he simply was told, turn right to 070 and launch your missile at 25 miles. Well, the biggest surprise for me was these guys weren't like that at all. They didn't care what the guy on the ground said. I mean, they will certainly obey orders, and if they don't obey orders, they end up in a pretty rugged rest camp somewhere. So they certainly listen to their superiors, but they were a little more independent thinking than that. And most military pilots really are. They'll tell you on the outside we're keeping rules, we'll look like robots, we're supposed to do our job, but on the side we'll just go do what we're supposed to do.
Peter, we're going to lunch.
During the Cold War, a Soviet pilot's job would never have included providing joyrides for rich Westerners. Today, the Russian aviation industry is in the midst of a worldwide promotion. Their unusual sales pitch is an opportunity to fly in one of Russia's most impressive jet fighters, the Sukhoi 27. Like the American F-16, this fighter interceptor demands attention. The passenger is treated to a once-in-a-lifetime experience as Russian pilots perform acrobatics for the sake of a possible sale. Thrill-seeking Westerners line up for the joyrides at $15,000 each. There have been allegations that these fees disappear into individual pockets rather than where the money is really needed, in the hands of Air Force pilots and technicians. For the man in the cockpit, the joyride provides a double bonus, a chance to show off his own flying skills while getting additional flying time. There is a glamour about this plane, but the true workhorse of the Russian Air Force is the Sukhoi 25, often known in the West by its NATO designation, the Frogfoot. This snub-nosed attack plane is simple, sturdy, fast, and highly maneuverable. The Su-25 is the Russian fighter pilot's plane of choice.
As any pilot, every pilot loves his plane. I love my plane because I flew it over 15 years. You know, I want to tell you a story. We were flying planes to deliver them to the army of one of the friendly countries. When we arrived, one of the pilots stepped out of his plane and kissed it. This is how we expressed our love of the plane, which gave us so many opportunities and saved our lives so many times. That's why we love them so much.
You American pilots fell in love with this plane too. When the Blue Angels visited us and we flew together, we flew F-18s with your pilots. And they flew MiG-29s, Su-27s. I invited them to try the Su-25. Most of them looked at the plane suspiciously. They didn't want to try it. Then we pushed one of their pilots into the plane. When he tried flying it, he liked it very much. He didn't expect this performance from this plane. After that, the American pilots were standing in line to fly it.
I've flown it. And I was very impressed. I was the first Western pilot to fly the airplane. And the reason? Nobody else wanted to fly it. It's an old Su-25. Same thing about it's an old A-10. Who wants to fly that? Now there's something unique in our country about the A-10. It has an institutional hatred. People don't like the A-10. Let's get rid of the A-10. Because it's a low-tech box. And you don't cram billion-dollar pieces of equipment in it. You cram a man in it with a good gun and some guts and some training, and the airplane survives, just like it did in Desert Storm. The Su-25 is their idea of our A-10. It has a decent 30 millimeter gun, certainly not like the gun in the A-10, but it fires a big round and it'll punch a hole in a tank. It'll carry a lot of weapons on the outside, bombs, rockets. And what's interesting about the Su-25 is, once you punch everything off of it, it will go over Mach 1. The A-10 doesn't even come close. It slows down and stops right around 400 knots. Whereas the Su-25 will go straight through the speed of sound, and it'll turn on a dime at great acceleration.
Our planes can work in any weather condition. Our operating parameters are from +50, +60 degrees centigrade in the shade to -80, -60 degrees centigrade. This is a wide range of parameters from negative to positive because of the territory of Russia is huge and climate is very different and difficult. Our planes and helicopters are designed to work in any region.
Perhaps it's appropriate for a plane nicknamed Frogfoot to have such an unassuming and decidedly unglamorous home. This is the flight line at Lipetsk Air Base, in the windswept steppes of central Russia. By Western standards, it appears to be suffering from years of neglect and disrepair. Lipetsk is actually not much different from its days as an important Soviet airbase.
The Russians never took great care with their facilities. Crumbling concrete was a standard because Russian concrete was of very poor quality. So it would decay on its own, and the rubble would be pushed aside. Since 1991, that reality has been amplified many times over. Now everything is pretty much in a state of rubble. Grass grows everywhere. Our machines aren't like that at all. Ours could not take anything along those lines to speak of, whereas theirs could. Russian equipment was made to operate in those conditions. It was made to operate in crumbling concrete, mud, sand, dirt, all kinds of things that don't starve the machinery of air or fuel.
And this was to become self-evident in the disastrous Afghan war. Historically, Russian aviation design has differed greatly from its US counterpart. It's often been said that American aviation designers go overboard, sacrificing simplicity for the sake of unneeded high-tech extras. Russian planes reflect Soviet military design policy, both practical and unfussy. Russian airplanes are uncluttered. In this Air Force, the emphasis is on sheer weight of numbers. The intent is to overwhelm the enemy, often at the cost of many pilots. Those who survive will most likely fly the Sukhoi 25. Like the US Air Force A-10, the Su-25 cockpit is a titanium strongbox. A barrage of 20mm gun rounds barely dents the flying tank's protective shield. Pilot and plane often escape unscathed.
The Su-25 belongs to ground attack aviation. It is a modern flying tank.
We find out quickly, once we start a war, we need that kind of in-the-face, knife-fighting type of airplane that will support the guy on the ground quickly, easily, and close. You got to get in close to support somebody. You don't stand off at 20 miles and support the guys on the front line. You got to get in there with a gun and some skill and maybe some night vision goggles and learn how to mix it up at the FIBA, at the forward edge of the battle area. That's what the Su-25 does. And that's why frontal aviation will never get rid of it as long as they've got some money. It's a simple airplane. It's got two MiG-21 engines in it. Reliable, been around for a long time. they can throw them away like cordwood and put more of them in. You can belly it in and jack it up, do a few repairs, and fly it off. It is a rugged, rugged airplane.
(1979). War breaks out on the Soviet southern border. This rugged terrain will become the flying tank's proving ground. Until now, the Su-25 was an untested prototype. The place is Afghanistan. Soviet troops invade on December the 27th, 1979.
When I went there, I believed that we were helping the Afghans to defend themselves from a foreign aggressor, which the Babrak Karmal regime was fighting. I believed it was a noble cause.
The so-called cause was to support the struggling Afghan communist regime. For 25 years, the Soviets poured foreign aid into Afghanistan. Then the help came in the form of military might. The Kremlin employed its usual strategy, deploying 100,000 troops and almost 5,000 advisors. In other words, to simply overwhelm the Afghan resistance.
The Russians were used to smashing any resistance so quickly, but soon they find out in Afghanistan that Afghanistan was not Czechoslovakia, Poland, or Hungary. Freedom-loving tribesmen have never learned submission.
Afghanistan's 7 main tribes have had a history of fighting among themselves long before the Soviets invaded. Yet, the brutal Soviet action served only to unify the 7 tribes. They now rallied together in a shared bitter hatred for the Soviets.
I wanted to avenge the deaths of the one which were close to me and my family, because vengeance in the Afghans something which has very deep roots. There is an Indian proverb that God save me from the teeth of the tiger, from the venom of the cobra, and the vengeance of the Afghans.
You know, from a pilot's point of view, it's very difficult to describe an enemy which you cannot see. The opposition which we felt and saw when we attacked indicated that the people were defending a definite interest. But what exactly those interests were, we did not know. We felt that they were well-prepared people who knew what they were fighting for.
The Afghan rebel fighters are called Mujahideen, meaning fighters of God. Strengthened with the spirit of a higher calling, these warriors cut through the ranks of the Soviet aggressors. The Soviets had a severe handicap. They had long trained for World War III against NATO troops on the open plains of Central Europe. The Soviets quickly discovered that their enemy were stealthy guerrillas, fighting in the narrow high mountain passes of the Hindu Kush. The Soviet ground troops didn't stand a chance. Most conscripts were undertrained and only 18 and 19 years old. By April 1980, it was soon becoming obvious that the troops would need more air support if they had any chance of gaining ground. Enter the Su-25.
I was with a colleague of mine, a cameraman, and I think we were probably among the first journalists to have seen the Sukhois. And I'd never come across fighter jets like that. They literally would fly in beneath you in the mountain valleys, and their maneuverability was extraordinary. And from what I gathered from the guerrillas, they were very anxious about the Sukhois. The MiGs tended to come into much higher levels. They would fly over the mountains, and they tended to fly in straighter paths than the Sukhois would. So when the Sukhois first appeared, they apparently were quite effective against the guerrillas, and the guerrillas didn't quite know how to deal with them as well. When people saw their first aircraft coming, they would run, which would draw attention to the pilots.
Despite a great technological advantage over the Mujahideen, Soviet by-the-book training and strict combat orders didn't allow for the flexibility required in this guerrilla war. At times, the Western stereotype of the robotic Soviet pilot held true.
The Soviet pilots had their orders, and they would not waver from these orders. Their order might be to move from point A to point B, and you could have an entire army of guerrillas moving underneath, and they wouldn't go to attack. Also, the Soviets tended to fight a very 9-to-5 war with their pilots. They would come in the morning, and they would stop at midday, and they'd be back at 2 in the afternoon. There was no element of surprise.
Ambush was the Mujahideen's strong suit. They broke up into small bands and spread out over Afghanistan's vast desert and high mountains. The land's natural nooks and crannies provided a perfect foil for the Su-25's bulk and natural speed.
I suppose these mountains were dangerous for their pilots also. They are the same for everyone. And don't yawn or you will end up crashing into mountains. We had to attack from one direction, or let us say from one side of the mountains, and the air defense naturally could expect from which side the attack was coming from.
The flying tanks carried the latest ordnance in the Soviet arsenal. Laser-guided bombs destroyed the narrow-mouthed caves of the Mujahideen. Also, the indiscriminate bombing of civilian centers in the Afghan valleys became an Su-25 mission. For 25 years, the Soviets helped build a modern infrastructure in one of the world's poorest countries. Now, they set out to destroy it. The flying tank was largely responsible for this carnage, dropping on average 4-ton loads of unguided bombs, salvos of 57mm rockets, and cluster munitions. The Soviets suffered the same fate as the Americans in Vietnam when trying to break the guerrillas' support systems.
Very often there were attacks against villages to try and make life as difficult as possible, to punish the civilians for their support of the guerrillas.
Punishing duty became the order for Soviet pilots. They were often sent on 5 missions a day. The conflict could no longer be called a 9-to-5 war. With less time to prepare, pilots depended more than ever on ground controllers who constantly corrected frog-foot maneuvers.
Sometimes we could not see a thing when we were flying, and we had to bomb according to the radio direction finder. Sometimes we could see a firefight over here, a firefight over there, so we could tell approximately where the front line was. I do not have any information that I have ever hit a civilian target, but it is possible. War is war, but I do not know about it.
Pilots knew that their bombs could stray anything up to 60 meters. Accurate strikes depended on accurate intelligence. This information was supplied to the Soviet ground forces by local friendly Afghans. But the Soviets quickly learned that the Afghan was an adept guerrilla fighter, and that included using deception.
Mistakes were made, but there is also the fact that Afghan military or civilian intelligence or forward observers who were pointing out targets for us were actually pointing out their personal blood enemies.
The battle lines were often blurred and uncertain. Compounding a lack of intelligence, the Soviets also had to deal with misinformation and especially spies within their own ranks. Among them is MiG pilot Major Jalal Wardak. For most of the war, he passed information to the Mujahideen. Then, on the verge of being discovered as a spy, Jalal narrowly escaped to Pakistan in his MiG-21. He joined the Mujahideen after years of flying alongside his communist countrymen and their Soviet supporters.
They were confused about me. I told the Mujahideen, okay, tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, this base going attack this area, that much planes. They were bombing that neighborhood. And they get away from that area. They completely changed their plan. Of course, the Russians, they have intelligence service. When they got a report back from there, how many people dead, they said 2 women, 2 kids, and 2-3 animals, no gorillas. And they got shocked. They said, gosh, how it's happened like that? When Russian, they were bombing somewhere, and we just see that, destroying the country, destroying the villages, and destroying the buildings and the houses. And we had some feeling like, we feel bad, like, what's going on, like, and they said, this is the enemy. But we couldn't ask them which enemy. Enemy, that's your enemy, but the country is mine, And I know that's not enemy, that's my brother, that's my blood. That's the person who's fighting for my land.
For Jalal Wardak, defecting to the Mujahideen meant sacrificing his flying career. But expelling the Soviets was a cause more important than his chosen occupation. At first, the Mujahideen's best defense against the Soviet jets were leftovers from an earlier war with the British. Mostly, they had British 303 rifles and captured recoilless weapons. Chinese-made heavy anti-aircraft machine guns and handheld Soviet-made missiles became part of the Mujahideen arsenal. These arms were numerous, but not reliable. Eventually, highly mobile Stinger missiles became an essential part of the Mujahideen arsenal. The Stinger had an immediate impact on the Soviet jets. Among the early hits were 4 flying tanks. 2 Soviet crew members perished.
It was hard, but we survived it. It's hard for anyone to lose a close friend. We all became close friends there.
It probably had psychological effectiveness The number of Stingers I saw probably 5 or 6, and each one I saw being fired missed. I think the information now, which has come out in recent years, indicates that the Stinger was not really that effective.
The ultimate psychological warfare waged was the graphic reports of Mujahideen atrocities against captured Soviet soldiers and airmen. At best, the Mujahideen would not give their prisoners water or food. At worst, the captors were inhumane, torturing and killing their prisoners. This prompted Soviet Su-25 pilots to expand their safety margin by flying higher and faster. The result was that ground troops became more vulnerable to capture or destruction.
Russians began to get shy. They didn't roam the skies. They were all the time looking at their back. The pilots were afraid of being knocked out of the sky. And that's, of course, very bad for an attack pilot. When he begins to think about his own safety, he tends to release his weapons and flee instead of hanging there and attacking, helping the ground troops. And that's, of course, changed the Russian effort, the Russian army, and they began to get less and less effective air support. And that really created a lot of havoc here in Moscow. Everyone began to yell that we need to find something to stop the Stinger. There was lots of billions of rubles, and then billions of rubles were a lot of money, were really poured into developing ways of deflecting Stingers.
The Stingers set off alarm bells in Moscow. It was yet another problem plaguing the Soviet war effort. The war had been terribly costly, both in terms of money and lives. Yet, not a single Afghan city outside Kabul fell to communist control. 7 years into the fighting, Afghanistan was referred to as a bleeding wound by Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev.
I will not give much credit to the Soviet Air Force capabilities. They were definitely very accurate, very destructive, and formidable against the civilian targets, especially the village. But against the Mujahideen, since Mujahideens were usually, we were winning because we were dispersed. We were ambiguous. We were elusive.
Even though the Afghan rebels didn't regularly take or hold any ground, they did continuously chip away at the Soviet will to stay and fight.
I would like to add here that we had a feeling that the Afghan government wanted to fight with their opponents using our hands instead of using their own means. The civil war was like watching a fight between two lovers. A third lover was not needed.
1989, the Soviets gave up and withdrew from Afghanistan. In 10 years, they had committed more than 1 million troops and pilots to a war that could not be won.
Throughout the history, you see they have always won. They were able to, in the past, to accept casualties which will be beyond our imagination. Like, in World War II, in the Battle of Kiev or Smolensk, 50 division will be destroyed here, 650,000 there, and still they will not give a damn. But because of the political unrest inside Soviet Union, I mean, while they were fighting in Afghanistan, they were sensitive to accepting higher casualties.
More than 1 million Afghan civilians died in the war. Afghanistan has not yet recovered. Though not wholly responsible, Afghanistan was the beginning of the end for the Soviets. Military and political disintegration followed. By 1991, the communist empire had fallen. However, this disintegration only led to further bloodshed on its borders. The road to independence is paved with much misery and death.
War is evil. People who have never been to a war dream about it, play wars. I remember during the upheaval, guns got into the White House. People got excited having weapons in their hands. I put my guns aside. It was nonsense. Anyway, these people were naive. They didn't know what war was. People coming back from Chechnya are not the same as people returning from a military service. The war makes them older, much older.
Weakened by internal strife, Moscow was unable to control rebellious republics on Russia's distant frontier. And one of these was the Muslim Republic of Chechnya, soon to become yet another military debacle. In September 1991, Chechnya tried to secede from Russia, ending nearly 175 long years of Russian domination. At first, Moscow tried financial aid and diplomacy to bring Chechnya back into the fold. It didn't work. In 1994, the Kremlin leadership made a tragic decision. In their eyes, total control could only be achieved through a ruthless military approach. Just 5 years after the loss in Afghanistan, Russian troops were sent east. Chechnya was complex, perhaps even more so than the situation in Afghanistan. Russian leaders conducted the war from the distance of the Kremlin, to catastrophic consequences. Colonel Valery Burkov, a decorated Afghan war veteran, was severely injured stepping on a landmine. Despite the loss of both legs, he's devoted to restoring strength and honor to the Russian Air Force.
After I got wounded and lost both legs, my commander came to visit me in the hospital. First of all, I asked him to help me stay in the Air Force. I knew the problems in the Air Force. I wanted to solve these problems. I didn't want other people to suffer needlessly. I wanted to raise the combat efficiency of the Air Force in support of the land forces.
Once again, the Sukhoi 25 was pushed into action. Pilots from Lipetsk Air Base were sent to local airfields. From there, Chechnya was well within the 640-kilometer range of a fully loaded Su-25. Chechnya was treated as an ideal venue for flying tank improvements devised during Afghanistan, such as precise laser targeting. Afghanistan also provided new knowledge about tactical airstrikes. But Air Force Command shelved most of those lessons in favor of brutal superpower warfare. The flying tank was assigned to deliver massive blows to defenders on the ground, paving the way for a flood of Russian troops. Initially, the Air Force attempted to sway the action in Chechnya through surgical airstrikes. Early on, the Su-25 exhibited powerful precision in a battle for an important strategic stronghold, the Chechen Presidential Palace.
The Chechens were in the bunker, and this palace was a former Soviet building, and it had a good anti-nuclear bunker beneath. And these Sukhoi 25s, they dropped very precisely several concrete piercing bombs that destroyed part of the bunker. Then the Chechens withdrew. And these were Sukhoi 25s, not more sophisticated, more electronically equipped Russian bombers. These were just the workhorse Sukhoi 25s.
Flying tank missions in support of the ground troops did not go as smoothly. They faced a new, unforgiving foe: the weather. Thick cloud cover rendered the Su-25's laser inoperable, so the Russians resorted to highly inaccurate, widespread bombing. This freed the Chechens to fight as they fought best, in the street. And, like the Afghan Mujahideen, the Chechens proved highly creative with any sort of arm they could acquire, everything from shotguns to shoulder-held anti-tank weapons. Where they could function, the Su-25s dodged fire from Chechen anti-aircraft guns, which the former Soviet rulers had left behind. This turned out to be the only piece of luck for the flying tank.
The Russians managed to divert these weapons. They have a special kind of electronic inbuilt system that doesn't allow Russian soldiers in combat conditions, when they might go wild, to shoot at their own aircraft. And so these weapons, the Chechens didn't manage to reprogram them, and the weapons recognized Russian attacking aircraft as friendly, and they refused to fire.
By the 1996 ceasefire agreement, only 2 Su-25s were reported shot down. And while Russian ground troops fared poorly during the conflict, the flying tank was a constant threat to the Chechen fighters.
I wouldn't say that the Russian Air Force has been crippled by Chechnya. Basically, of all the services of the Russian army, this is the service that came out best. They had very low losses. This was basically their war. The Chechens hated them very much, and they killed pilots. If they ever got any pilots, captured them, they killed them immediately, because it was the Air Force that was giving them the most punishment.
Punishment provided by the flying tank: scarred land, ruined cities, more refugees. In purely destructive terms, Chechnya, and Afghanistan for that matter, could be described loosely as victories. In truth, the indiscriminate massacre is the result of grossly inaccurate bombing missions. The air war in Chechnya quickly exposed severe weaknesses in the Russian Air Force: aging equipment, poor training, and an inability to overcome the weather.
From military and political points of view, we forgot our experience in Afghanistan during the war in Chechnya. We haven't learned much. We are repeating the same mistakes.
An eternal flame symbolizes the commitment to soldiers and pilots who fought in the former Soviet Union's campaigns. World War II veterans are held in exceptionally high esteem. But Moscow's Red Square has no memorial for those who fought and died in the much more recent wars in Afghanistan and Chechnya. It appears the Russian leadership doesn't want people to remember these conflicts. But the thousands who fought will never forget.
We don't have any special privileges. Sometimes in the press and among people, I run across a negative attitude towards the war. I feel very bad when I see it. It was our soldiers' duty.
Devotion to military duty is nearly the only incentive left for airmen during Russia's economic crisis. There is scant hope for a glorious return of the Air Force in the foreseeable future.
What can I say? And what I'm saying to young pilots who join our unit is that you should not fear. There is no need to fear. And you should not fear, you should go on with your profession, which was always considered to be one of the highest technically intelligent professions. Because, of course, pilot combines several professions for his proficiency. And basically, I think that it will remain the same, and especially in this country, which always had a very high respect for its pilots.
In modern Russia, respect for airmen comes at too great a price. Meanwhile, back at Lipetsk Air Base, a rare display of respect for Russia's pilots was shown. It was payday, the first payday these flying tank pilots have had in 3 months.